Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this afternoon's event, an in conversation and question and answer session on pilgrimage, past and present. I'm Dr. Kate Giles and I am delighted this afternoon to be in conversation with Dr. Dee Dyas from the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture. Now, a few technical notes before we start. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A function on your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any point. Should you have any technical issues, such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it again. Subtitles are also available in this event. To turn these on or off, you can use the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So, with those housekeeping issues out of the way, I'm delighted to welcome Dee Dyas. Dee is a reader in the history of Christianity, and she is director of the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture and the Centre for Pilgrimage Studies at the University of York. She's the author of 2 recent volumes, The Dynamics of Pilgrimage, and she's also co-edited Pilgrimage and England's Cathedrals. And those volumes come out of some very large Arts and Humanities Research Council funded projects on pilgrimage and England's cathedrals past and present. This afternoon, we're going to think particularly about a project Dee has been leading with partners at Canterbury and London, focusing particularly on the 2020 Thomas Becket anniversary as a catalyst to enhance heritage, tourism and community engagement. And I hope Dee will tell us a little bit more about the Centre's work more broadly with research-based heritage interpretation partnerships with other cathedrals and institutions. I'm Kate Giles and my specialism is in archaeology, and I'm particularly interested in medieval buildings. So I've got lots of questions for Dee this afternoon. And the way that we're going to operate this afternoon's Q&A is that I have a series of questions that I want to ask Dee, and she's going to respond to those for about 35 minutes or so. And then we'll open up the floor to more questions from the Q&A. So Dee, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I hope many of our audience will have been able to watch your lecture, which is available on the York Festival of Ideas YouTube account. And I was absolutely fascinated to watch it myself. I learned a whole lot about it, about pilgrimage, past and present, the really deep history of pilgrimage. And I'm very interested this afternoon to think about how you've been working with colleagues at your centre to bring a particular pilgrimage story to life, using scholarly research, cutting-edge digital technologies. But I wanted to start this afternoon by inviting you to reflect a little bit more on the place of pilgrimage in modern culture. Now, I guess we all have ideas of pilgrimage, my own probably based largely on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But there seem to have been a host of recent television programmes, radio programmes about pilgrimage, taking some inspiration from pilgrimage routes in the past, for example, the Santiago to Compostela route. So I wondered if you could help us think a little bit about how this modern interest, almost kind of obsession with pilgrimage, relates to medieval or older ideas of pilgrimage, and why you think pilgrimage is so popular today.
Thank you, Kate. It's lovely being able to have this conversation with you and to explore a little bit more about pilgrimage. I think the reason I became interested in pilgrimage was that I could see it operating in previous centuries, but I could also see it coming to life again around me in the last 20, 30 years. And that really made me ask just that question. Why? Why in what is supposedly a sort of post-religious culture? Why were people suddenly interested in walking, in going to special places? And the more I've worked on this over the past 20, 30 years, the more it seems to me that pilgrimage actually tells us something quite important about ourselves as human beings, that we actually are hardwired to be attached to particular places, to find meaning in them or to put our own meaning onto them. And that the journey to these places therefore becomes very significant. I think we also need ways of processing things that happen to us, whether they're good things or bad things, joyful things, sad things. And the combination of that means that if you look back through the centuries and you go right back to classical times, to the Bible, to the medieval period, in all of these places, you can see people saying, I need things. I need things in my life. I need to sort things out. I need the experience of getting outside of my ordinary life, creating some space. And also, I want to find in spaces things that people have told me about. In the Middle Ages, it was, as actually in the early classical period, it was people would have come back and said, I went to this site and I was healed. Or I went to this site and I prayed to have a baby and I've had a baby. And a lot of it was about personal testimony and sharing and creating that sense of excitement and anticipation. Now, as you said, we tend to see it on TV, and that's very influential. There was also a very powerful film called The Way, which came out a while ago. And I know a number of people who's told me they were inspired to go on pilgrimage because that was the story of a father going to Compostela in connection with his experiences with his son. And I think people, it's the human stories combined with the special places. These days, there are some extra elements. In the Middle Ages, it would have been great to get away from your work life. A holiday was not such a great, such a common thing. Holy days, yes, but actually a real break. But also today we value other things like being connected with nature. In earlier centuries, you just were connected with nature. You didn't have to make an effort. Similarly, walking would not have been a great treat. Now we are looking at exercise, at reconnecting with nature, with ecological issues, and just space in our lives is a hugely valued commodity. And so those things are all coming together. And what's interesting is that people are often now using those ancient sites as their goals. There are pilgrim networks, cycle networks, pathways opening up all around the UK. And people are using those. We like to have a goal. We don't just want to wander off aimlessly. We like to be going somewhere. And then actually what people are finding is that when they get to these spaces, they begin to encounter some of the things that people found in the past.
Thank you, Dee. I mean, it's really interesting the conversation about what pilgrimage is, but also who can be a pilgrim. And it's interesting that you're suggesting there that anybody can be a pilgrim. I think perhaps for some people there's an assumption that you can only go on pilgrimage if you're religious. But is there something there that's much more about a much broader definition of being a pilgrim these days that's much more all-encompassing? And is COVID a factor? Do you think that's going to kind of change people's attitudes to pilgrimage and being a pilgrim searching for something?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that through this recent times, we tend to see our definitions of pilgrim as what we might imagine as somebody like a medieval pilgrim, with a staff, a hat, a bag, going on a long journey. In fact, in the Middle Ages, people often went to places quite close to them because it was the place, not the length of the journey, that really mattered, unless you were doing penance for something you'd done, which you had to make up for. But I think that the parallels we're seeing today are that people of all faiths and none are wanting to engage with pilgrimage. And it's one of the words, one of the very few religious words, one of the very few Christian terms that has remained current. We all seem to have a sense that by pilgrimage, you mean a special journey to a special place. Now, it could be going back to your old school for a reunion. It could be going back to the place where you got married. My husband and I last week were at Gretna Green, as it happens, and we were on holiday. Now, a friend had got married there, and so we took a photo to send to them, because that would have been, if they'd gone back, it would in that sense have been a pilgrimage to them, a place laden with memories and for the creation of new memories. So we know what this is about. People went on pilgrimage to Portugal to the Euro matches. We use that word a lot, and we just kind of know what it means. But that means it can have a whole range of meanings. It can be very broad. We know that around pre-COVID, about 200-300 million people a year were going on religious pilgrimage. But also, I went once to the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, and people go there every day, and they leave little offerings. They leave boots, they leave army kit, because they want to see the names of those who've died. And that is a secular pilgrimage. And there are many others. There's Graceland, where people devoted to St. Elvis go, and they have candles. They leave prayers. It's just like a pilgrimage site. And I think it's something that we have inside us that needs this. Also, we are now surrounded by little shrines everywhere. Somebody dies in a tragic accident, in a house fire, or on a road, and we see now the flowers, the gifts, the prayers, the messages, the candles. And it's as if we have to, something impels us to have rituals that mark these things and help us get through them.
Thank you, Dee. I was fascinated in your book, and you touched on it too in the lecture, about how you decided to approach the theme of pilgrimage in your own writing and work, particularly through thinking about the senses and working with colleagues, neuroscientists, social scientists, to think particularly about the complexity of the senses. I think you suggested, we often think of the 5 senses, that there are up to 30 different senses that our colleagues across the sciences and social sciences are saying we need to get our heads around now. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how places of pilgrimage make use of the senses, or how people experience these sites using things like kinesthesia. If I've got that right. Thank you.
Yes, it's one of the things I found absolutely fascinating. Pilgrimage is not a subject you can keep within a discipline. It just isn't. And I think that the neuroscientists might be quite surprised to find how much their work has been helping us understand this. Because if you think about the experience of moving through the countryside or whatever it is on a journey, but also when you arrive at a particular site, the more I looked at it, the more I realized actually these buildings are not that way by accident. They are physically, architecturally designed to do something to us physically and psychologically. And there's a long pattern, they're in a long tradition going right back again to classical temples or to building the temple in the Bible. And they're designed to give us a sense that we fit within these buildings. You mentioned kinesthesia, that's the sensation of movement. There's also something called proprioception, which is where the sense of where your body is in space. So if you walk into a huge cathedral, immediately you tend to look up, because the vaults, etc., all encourage you, and the windows to do that. That does something to your brain. It does something to the blood flow to the brain, and it makes you feel a certain way. It makes you feel a sense of euphoria. And the architecture, it makes you feel quite small, but it also makes you feel quite uplifted. These buildings were designed to be full of stimulus, visual stimulus, but also smells, the smell of incense or the smell of wax candles, and that would have encompassed you. The visual material is in front of you, but smells and music, sounds, actually are all around you. And so you feel buoyed up, lifted by them. The idea of movement's terribly important as you move between buildings, and they were designed to work in certain ways. So sometimes when we've been working with cathedrals, we had to say, you've got people going in that door. That wasn't supposed to happen. You're supposed to come in this way, and then you see this, and then you see this, and then you have the chance to do that, and then you arrive at the center. And actually, cathedrals have been thinking more about how they were designed to work for pilgrims in the past. And actually, it's a cumulative thing as you build up, and every single part of this, and other senses like heat, cold, pressure, all of these are internal senses as well as external senses, and also very much the idea that senses are two-way channels. And I think in the past, we've tended to think that senses were optional extras. Some people engage with their brains and some people use their senses. Well, I'm really sorry, but you cannot. Your brain doesn't work on its own. You have to have the senses feeding in material, which is then processed by the brain, which then feeds back again. And there is no, somebody said there is no pure sensory input. It comes to you, and your brain, without you knowing it, is processing it through what you already know, believe, or have experienced. So it's like there's this little computer whirring away and processing it all. So I think it's really important to say that, and that's what helps create emotion. And again, a lot of work on emotion and the senses has shown that we only learn what we feel strongly about. That's true. I have 2 sons. Try sending them to school in the past and getting them to learn about things they are not interested in. Not going to happen. And it's a great, emotion is a huge motivator for learning, for response, and the creation of memory, which is what we take away and then changes as long term. So these buildings have, these architects, the planners, those who managed them, who created worship, created experience, they knew exactly what they were doing.
So there's that idea of some of these places being natural sites of kind of natural beauty, which are then kind of enhanced architecturally, and some of these other sites of pilgrimage are very architectural and spatial, and to that we bring, you know, bodily experience. But I was wondering whether we have, you know, we could sort of ground that in a couple of examples to you know, get a sense of how they worked with other objects or things that were encountered. You mentioned that idea of coming in and visiting this and then that and then that. So things like shrines, I guess, the kind of choreography. Do we know, how do we know about how they were experienced and how they worked in practice, particularly perhaps in the Middle Ages?
We have an extraordinary amount of material. In fact, we have archives which include things like at Canterbury, they had a customary, which was basically the rule book and the guidebook for the manual for those who looked after the shrine. And it had everything from how they cleaned it to how they locked it up at lunchtime so dogs didn't get in while they weren't there, the size of the candles that they put up, and how they managed those who came, the pilgrims who came. Durham Cathedral, again, we have records which help us to understand, and we know from the changes, the architectural changes that were made, that people were thinking really hard about the effect that visiting, coming particularly as pilgrims, had upon people. So Durham Cathedral is a really good example. At one point, the shrine of St Cuthbert was really the heart of the cathedral. And you would have come in the west door and then gradually made your way there. But before they did anything about it, they had a problem because the monks would be in the choir, the area of the choir, singing, but the shrine was also very close by. So the answer to that was to build the Chapel of 9 Altars as an ambulatory around, so that pilgrims could come and visit the shrine, kneel in the niches by the shrine, see this amazing glittering edifice at the same time without disrupting the monastic worship. That had an interesting effect because actually the pilgrims, we know, responded really positively to the music, the worship, the singing, the sounds flowing out over them. The same happened at Canterbury. So it intensified their experience. And sometimes you get a phrase in an account. They collected often miracle stories at the cathedrals, at the pilgrimage sites, and you can read lots of stories. And we hear that people are healed as the worship is going on. So it seems that intensified the sense of God's presence, of holiness, of the potential of healing. And that's something that seems to have worked very powerfully. And it's as if in the Middle Ages, for example, Durham, the whole place was seen as almost one huge reliquary. Cuthbert might have been buried in one part of it, but the whole cathedral was his cathedral, and you touched the walls, and you leant against somebody with a toothache, a really bad toothache, leant against the shrine and who was healed. And you've got all of these things. People used to sleep beside the shrines, which is something they did in ancient Greece. And they would often have dreams that the saint would emerge from the tomb, from the shrine in the night and touch them. And they'd wake up in the morning and they were fine. And so you can see this very intense engagement with the physicality of the place was really, really important. And touch above everything. Sound is hugely important, but touch is actually our most basic sense. And it is that gives a sense of reality and connectedness. And so being able to touch parts of the building, touch the shrine, that was hugely important to people.
And Dee, I think in your lecture you talked a little, I mean, I was, you know, those very compelling images of people kind of crawling into the shrines, which looked quite sort of dangerous, but also people left things at shrines. And I wonder if you could tell us about the idea of the little wax objects, hands, legs, parts of the body, ship models, other sorts of objects which were left as ways of kind of inviting the saint to pray for you, or what was the idea behind leaving those objects behind?
Well, they are connected with either asking for a response or for saying thank you for a response. And these, again, actually, these go back right back to ancient Greece, where you will see in places, museums, places like Corinth, you will see these ex voto offerings, these offerings connected with vows, and you will see ears, arms, legs, all kinds of parts of the human body where somebody either wanted to ask for healing or has experienced healing and is giving that as a thank you. And it's one of the ideas that came into Christian pilgrimage when it kind of really started to happen in the 4th century, and has stuck with us ever since. And actually, if you go to many other countries, Greek Orthodox churches, you will see often now they're made of silver or other substances. But it's a really important thing because it gives the person an opportunity to express physically what they want to do and make sure that the person you're praying to knows exactly what you want to happen. But also, these offerings left mean as somebody approaches a shrine, they see lots of other people have asked for help here as well. And lots of other people have received help here. So it makes you part of a community and it encourages faith. So it is part of the purpose of these sites, which is partly to show you things about God and the saints and encourage you to respond and to trust and to have your life changed. Because that's what people needed, especially in the Middle Ages, when they didn't have much in the way of medical intervention. And it was a very tough and dangerous world.
So people, again, from your lecture, people liked to give presents to the shrine. I was fascinated some of the descriptions of the jewels, the textiles, the clothing, the rich velvets and other things that people would give to shrines. And I wondered if we could sort of move now to think about some of the challenges that you and your team at the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture face in reconstructing these sites, as you do, not just in kind of written form, but now harnessing digital technology to try and reconstruct them. So obviously, if we're thinking about pilgrimage in the United Kingdom, we have this big thing, the Reformation, which gets in the way of preserving all these gorgeous objects, the shrines themselves, the jewelry, the textiles, the vestments. And so most of them get destroyed during the 16th century. And I was wondering, do we know what happened to all this gorgeous bling that was left at these places? What was the reaction to the suggestion that all of this stuff was going to disappear from cathedrals, and what on earth survives today for us to kind of use as evidence?
Well, I think what happened to an awful lot of it, the jewels and the gold, etc., was that the king got it, or other people got it. Some was hidden, some was spirited away abroad, and some survived. Some things survived, such as the St. William window at York, which actually shows us quite a lot about medieval pilgrimage. It's an extraordinary description of how medieval pilgrims came to the shrines, the sort of things they suffered from. And we've got pictures there of offerings of limbs hanging up. And then coupled with that, we have documents, again, at the Minster, which describe what was there. So when we were coming to recreate the shrine, well, we've done several. We've done Lichfield Cathedral, the Shrine of St. Chad. We've recreated the Shrine of St. Cuthbert at Durham. But the biggest project we've done is at Canterbury, and there we employed we had a brilliant team. We had a 3 to 4 year project when we looked at this, and we wanted to recreate the shrine, first of all, because of the splendor of it. And we have medieval descriptions from people in England, but also people coming from abroad, of how it was festooned with jewels and pearls. This was important because, again, it showed that people valued the saint, but it also, all the way through the history of pilgrimage, gold jewels have signified holiness and power. So these were a message in themselves. They're also the monk's treasury. So they built up a huge amount of wealth through them. Of course, that made them vulnerable then when Henry VIII decided that he might like some of this for himself. But I think, you know, we had to work from the records, from pilgrim descriptions, from the cathedral's own archives, we worked with Canterbury Archaeological Trust, all of their vast experience. We looked at the fabric to see where things might have been attached. So we then ended up recreating 4 sites within the cathedral, which were the main ones used by pilgrims. We created a mass, which would have happened during the night, on the eve of the feast of the martyrdom, where pilgrims would have come, very cold, 29th of December, not a great time to be visiting Canterbury. They've been given a fire, some food, and then they would have had a mass in the dark. Very powerful. We've also looked at the crypt, where the original tomb of Thomas was, and that's where pilgrims who had really major illnesses would have come and stayed. But then we worked a great deal on the main shrine. The shrine was created on the main floor of the cathedral. Now it's just an empty space with a candle burning at its center. It's a very powerful space, but it is nothing like what was there. And we used all of these tools, brilliant work by colleague John Jenkins, colleague Louise Hampson, in researching all of this, and a whole team of people, including our fantastic tech team, who are brilliant at digital modeling. People often say to me, who did all this for you? And I said, we did it. Our team does it. Our team are amazing, because our technology team are archaeologists, so they have this expertise and understanding. And we work with the cathedral archives and archivist, and together we gradually began to piece together how it would have looked as you made your way, and you move up stage by stage in Canterbury. And what I was really interested in was what it would have done to you as you got closer and closer. Could you see that glittering shrine from the steps further down? Then we worked out that you had a grille all around it. You had railings, and on those railings would have been those ex-voto offerings. So your very view of the shrine was framed by those objects from other people. Then as you got closer, it would have been managed. You could have seen the windows, the amazing Canterbury stained glass, which shows the miracles of Saint Thomas. And in our animation, we have a monk showing this to the pilgrims. We have another monk showing them the wonderful jewels on the shrine itself. We have people kneeling, and then we have people coming. And these are stories from the records, from the miracle records. We show somebody who was in danger of shipwreck at sea, very common experience in the Middle Ages, and was saved and is coming to say thank you to St. Thomas. Then we have a couple who are bringing a child who's been healed in answer to prayer. So they place the child briefly on the altar and say thank you. And these are real human stories. And, you know, we can all relate to this. Problems with travel, problems with family, illness. These are the things that they came for, as well as sometimes often also asking for forgiveness and for greater understanding in their spiritual lives. But the way that was framed, I wanted to know, what could you see and when? How would it affect you as you move through the space? And that's what the Canterbury models have enabled us to see. And it has revealed a great deal, which we didn't really know before.
And Becket himself, Dee, we've sort of described the sort of experience of the shrine a little bit, but what is so important about Becket? What prompted this project to happen? There's a kind of timeliness at the moment, but why do you think he's such a compelling saint? I'm loath to kind of give him the credit, given that, you know, the old rivalry between York and Canterbury, but why is Becket so important, really?
He is in some ways the most unlikely saint. And I mean, he was born in London, in Cheapside. He was born to reasonably affluent Norman parents, but he made his way up the career ladder very quickly. He had good education. He was taken in by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he got on good terms with the king. He was made chancellor when Henry became king. Then the Archbishop died, and Henry thought, right, we'll have all the levers of power in our hands. I'll make Thomas Archbishop. Thomas Upton had been a bit of a worldly character, not your most likely Archbishop. But when he became Archbishop, it's as if he suddenly changed. And he started taking the church seriously, started taking faith seriously, started giving a lot away, started disciplining himself. And Henry suddenly found this wasn't a friend who was going to say yes to everything. It was a friend who was saying, oh, hang on a minute. I don't actually agree with you anymore. And there was a lot of toing and froing. Thomas went into exile. Thomas came back. And Henry was still angry. And the famous, when he says, who will rid me of this turbulent priest, and people galloped through the night across the Channel and to Canterbury. And Thomas was not minded to give in. And Thomas died then. And it was so shocking that an archbishop could be murdered in his own cathedral, the blood falling on the stones of the cathedral. And it absolutely shocked the whole of Christendom. It spread. Thomas's cult immediately emerged. There were miracles very, very rapidly. And Henry himself had to come and do penance for what he'd inadvertently caused to happen, or partly inadvertently. But suddenly Thomas, I think, just his reputation spread across Europe. Sicily, the king's daughter went to Sicily, and one of the cathedrals there, large cathedral, there's a mosaic, a very early mosaic of Thomas. Norway, there are churches dedicated to Thomas all over Europe, and he became a really powerful figure. He was a martyr in a very spectacular way, and he was a martyr who answered prayer. And he was also a martyr who answered prayer and then really, really liked you to say thank you. He got rather annoyed if you didn't. And if you didn't, then not very good things might happen to you. So there was a real impetus to come. He had power, and he exercised it posthumously under the care of the cathedral in a really remarkable way. Canterbury itself was shaped by this. It became the major pilgrimage destination. Sorry, Durham, sorry, York, in England in the Middle Ages. Important as those two were. And that's something that I think has then left its mark. And he very conveniently died, and his shrine was in a round figure number. So we're now celebrating, in 2020, we were celebrating what we think is probably his birth in 1119 or 20. His death 50 years later, his translation into a beautiful shrine in 1220, and then so those three dates made 2020 a really important year. So we planned a wonderful range of things. Of course, COVID hit, and that made a difference. We still managed to do a lot, and there is now our recreation of the shrine is now featuring in a British Museum exhibition on Thomas, which is running at the moment, or running until late August, a spectacular exhibition. And I think it touched something. There's something about Thomas. He was very upwardly mobile, and then he came to a point where suddenly his conscience wouldn't take it anymore, and he had to decide what to do. And I think quite a lot of people can relate to that. As a saint who had a really tough choices to make. He took the hard route, and he paid the price. But then he became a figure who actually was then crucial at the Reformation, because we have a second Henry, Henry VIII, who wasn't really very keen on the idea of an archbishop who stood up to the king when the king wanted to do things and change things. And when the Reformation came, Becket was the one who suffered the most. He was the one whose image was to be absolutely wiped out. All reference to him was to go, and we've got manuscripts where he's crossed out, we've got images scrubbed out on rood screens and that kind of thing. And yet, here we are celebrating him in the 21st century. So again, it's like pilgrimage. Thomas isn't minded to lie down and be quiet.
Yes, and there's that idea that the more you have to sort of try and erase a saint, the more you try and get rid of them, the more you're reinforcing their power, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. And one of the things that struck me, Dee, from the reconstructions you showed in your lecture was that, we've talked about the way in which the experience of pilgrimage worked in the cathedral, but from what you were saying, it sounds as if the whole of Canterbury got in on the act. There's a, it's a city-wide experience, and I was absolutely fascinated with that beautiful reconstruction that the tech team at Christianity and Culture had created of the medieval city itself, sort of showing the scale of the cathedral towering above the timber-framed buildings of the city. So it's as if the whole city itself becomes part of that landscape and experience of pilgrimage. Is that one of the things that you were interested in understanding through that modelling, as well as the modelling of the shrine?
Absolutely. The city was very much shaped by the pilgrimage. And one of the fascinating things about that model is that you can see the pilgrim inns, you can see the routes that people would have come in, and you can see where pilgrims, the hospice where pilgrims stayed, the whole city. And the wonderful thing about Canterbury, as indeed about York, is that you can still go and find these traces. But one of the things, one of the reasons we wanted to do this was to work with the Visit Canterbury, with the City Council, with the business improvement teams, etc., and the cathedral, and say, look, don't just come to Canterbury for an hour to visit the cathedral. This is an immensely rich place. The tourism offer is potentially huge, and that has really been taken on board by all of our partners and the Canterbury museums, who are also running an exhibition at the moment. And it's something that I think they're really seeing pilgrimage as a very important thing for them today, and routes developing all over Kent, green pilgrimage, all sorts of things happening, people coming again from abroad, but also seeing that you need to explore the whole story of a city. And every time I show this somewhere around the country, I'm asked, have you done this for York? And the answer is, not yet. We'd love to, because it's exactly the same here.
Oh,
We have
right.
a stunning cathedral, but we also have an immense rich variety of places to explore. And there is a connection, the stories are interconnected. And it would be brilliant to be able to do this at York as well, because it's turning into a fantastic tourism tool for Canterbury. And I'd love to see York, I share your bias, I'd love to see York have this as well.
Well, maybe that will prompt some of our audience to ask to pop some questions in the Q&A, and just to give people a little bit of an alert. We've got a couple of minutes before we open up to some questions. So I wondered, Dee, if you could sort of tell us a little bit, you mentioned Canterbury embracing this, so the kind of tourist board being on board, sort of, but also London, the City of London being very interested in the Becket story and that experience. Could you, I know we're still not quite out of lockdown, but could you give our audience a bit of a sense of, why they should go to Canterbury, or what they might experience if they do go to Canterbury, what might be on offer, partly through the work of the centre and colleagues and partners at Canterbury? How can they experience or view these wonderful reconstructions, or tread in the footsteps thanks to the work you and the team have done?
Well, the cathedral has been working on a very large lottery-funded project for several years now. And there will be a whole new exhibition centre. There will be handheld guides to take you around the cathedral, and the models will form part of both of those. Inevitably, obviously, they've been delayed by COVID, but hopefully, I think by the end of this year, they should be up and running. And again, as I say, the tourism people are using the images and using the map, the city map, to show people how the relationship and just how close things are. They've got one of the earliest, if not the earliest, church in the country, St Martin's. They've got St Augustine's Abbey. They've got a pilgrim hospital, and they've got the inns. And you just have to walk around Canterbury. You can touch it, as indeed you can with the history of York. And so I think people can go and explore, hopefully COVID permitting. But if you want to see the models, there's a lot of information on the Christianity and Culture website, where people can explore things. And that's something that's had to be happening recently. Pilgrimage has been virtual. It was sometimes virtual in the Middle Ages for those who couldn't go themselves. But I think we are going to see a resurgence, definitely. COVID, and we've been also working on a very big project on the impact of COVID and not having churches and cathedrals available when people are in need. And I think there is going to be a resurgence of wanting to go to places, wanting to go and have time and just to catch up with ourselves, and to use these places for that purpose for which they were designed.
Dee, thank you so much. You've given us a wonderful insight. You know, you managed to compress a huge amount of information into our Q&A, and I'll signpost people again back to the lecture. But we have got some questions coming in, and please, I'd encourage our audience just to pop anything in the Q&A. Our first question is about the reconstruction, the visual reconstruction, but also asking how we recreate the smells and sounds of the past accurately, Dee. So I wonder if you could say, I don't know whether you've reconstructed any smellscapes, but soundscapes as well. How do we know about those things?
Well, we do know quite a lot of, well, we know a lot about medieval worship, and there have been some very good projects, including one that was run by Professor John Harper about reconstructing the medieval mass. We know we've done quite a bit of research about these music particularly associated with Thomas Becket, and in fact we had a wonderful lecture in London, which is also online on Becket in London. And before that, we've had a special team of medieval people who specialise in medieval music singing some of the music was composed in honour of Thomas Becket. We do have a good sense of what the sounds would have been. The smells a little more difficult to recreate. Some of them wouldn't be terribly welcome, I think, if we were going to have the scene around the tomb of Thomas Becket in the crypt of Canterbury. I think smelly in not a good way would probably be a lot of sick people, a lot of not terribly well washed people sometimes. But the smell of incense, and we know that there would definitely have been around. And it's interesting that the verger at York Minster sometimes, if things are getting a little loud in the Minster, sometimes just light some incense to remind people this is a special place. And it's amazing how scents quieten people down. But we know there were huge wax candles, and wax was a very proper candle wax was a very sweet smelling.
So that would have been a beeswax, Dee, rather
candle. Yes.
A lot of medieval candles were sort of tallow, pig fat.
Yes, no, it would have been beeswax. They were very expensive, and they were one of the things that people gave to the cathedral, to the shrine. So there would have been and I think that's one of the things that would have marked places out for people, because there would have been sweet smells, whereas many homes would not have smelled very sweet. And so this again, this goes back a very long way to the Bible and beyond. Sweet scents are seen again as marking the place apart and making it holy, making it different, and suggesting power. So all of these things are cues.
Yes, thank you so much. We've got a question from Sharon, which is asking a really interesting question about whether secular pilgrims gain the same experience of sites of pilgrimage without the filter of religious faith that earlier pilgrims might have had, Dee.
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. I think if people who do not regard themselves as signed up to any particular faith tradition visit religious sites, it's a really interesting dynamic. We did a lot of work in our very big research project, and we had a team of social scientists interviewing, observing people, and it's very interesting. A lot of people say tick the no religion box, as they do on a census. But then as you talk to them, you find that doesn't mean they're not interested in spirituality. It doesn't mean they don't want to pray. It doesn't mean they don't want to be a pilgrim. They don't want to light a candle. What they mean is they're not signed up to any particular set of official teaching or practice. And I think as human beings, we do, most would feel we have kind of some sort of spiritual side, whatever we mean by that. And I think the great thing about these places is they allow you to explore that in whatever way you want. And so I think people often go into these places and they find themselves becoming almost accidental pilgrims. I got slightly confused because one of our researchers sent me a quote from somebody who said about Canterbury Cathedral that he felt it was standing there as a place of witness, and she put at the bottom a pilgrim to Canterbury. When I went back and read the transcript of the interview, I realized that he started off by ticking the no religion box. And then by the time he'd worked through what he felt coming to this place, he suddenly said, you know what, I think I'm becoming a pilgrim, which was quite different. And that's something that tends to happen to people. And I think because pilgrim is quite a neutral word in a strange kind of way, many people are happy to be pilgrims without actually adding any extra adjective or label to it. And I think a pilgrim is somebody who is happy and open to engaging with a place and finding in it meaning, and creating their own meaning, taking their own meaning, but able to enjoy it and engage with it in a way that often is quite spontaneous. We have a team saying, which I think I may have quoted in the lecture, if you scratch a pilgrim, you'll probably find a tourist, because pilgrims don't just operate on a pure level. They want to see things, buy things, take things home as well. But also scratch a tourist and you may well find a potential pilgrim. Because we found that these distinctions were they weren't meaningless, but they weren't very hard and fast. And that people might go in for one reason, a heritage reason, and then suddenly sit there and say, you know what, I'm thinking about my life in a different way. Just because I'm in this place where thousands and thousands of people have been, brought their problems, brought their needs, and it's beautiful and it's peaceful. And that's one of the things that people have missed during COVID. And we know that people are desperate, even if they don't normally go to church, many of them, they actually want these beautiful spaces where they can just be.
And that's
beautiful spaces.
I guess people who are looking after old buildings, sites that could be potential sites of pilgrimage in the natural world, or buildings themselves, need to be aware of that people may be coming for lots of different reasons, not just a tourist, but searching for something else as well. We've got a great question, and it's great, Fran, to have you all the way from St Magnus in Orkney. Fran's really interested in the evidence for people ingesting material from buildings, and they think, if I'm right in understanding, Fran, you think that you've got marks in the stone which could be examples of pilgrims scraping out bits of stone, possibly to mix with water and to drink, which sounds like a highly dubious practice if you're searching for healing. But Dee, do we have any definite examples of people kind of taking bits of earth or stone or something away from a pilgrimage place to consume?
Yes, I mean, this starts back in the 4th century in Christian pilgrimage, and because when the Holy Land was developed as a Holy Land, Jerusalem and other sites, there came a sense that everything about it, including the very earth, was holy, and the stones. And taste is one of the senses we haven't mentioned so far, but people did actually either get earth and put it into water, or they scraped off little bits of stone and into dust, powder, and drank that, because there is a sense that the whole space, the whole building, or the whole site is infused with holiness. And therefore you want to take some of that away with you. What better, in a sense, what more powerful than to actually ingest it? Just as to go back to Becket, and this sounds perfectly disgusting, but it wasn't seen that way. They washed the stones where his blood had fallen, and they gave people very, very homeopathic quantities of Thomas blood in water to drink. And I'm sure it wasn't even discernible anymore by the time it finished. But there is this sense that of taking something into yourself could be powerful, and people want to engage. They don't just want to touch; they actually want to take the holiness inside themselves. So yes, may sound strange, but definitely happened.
I think that's one aspect of reconstructing pilgrimage practice that I'm happy to leave to your team rather than experience myself. But you did, in the lecture, Dee, you mentioned, I mean, we often think about souvenirs, the cathedral gift shop, or the, as being a modern phenomenon. But again, people wanted to take objects away from a shrine. They wanted to buy something or take something home to show they'd been a pilgrim.
Absolutely. And again, that goes back to that early Holy Land experience where they started taking home stones. There's a box, I think I showed in the lecture, which is now in the Vatican. It's just a box of stones and earth. But actually, it's probably more valuable than anything anybody possessed. It's more valuable than silver or gold, just as the relic inside a reliquary was, the bone or the piece of saint was more valuable in people's eyes than the gold and silver. And this has gone on all the way through the centuries. And what's lovely is in the Middle Ages, I've got a colleague in the States who's done a lot of work on this, and she has found that people had little DIY reliquaries. Reliquaries could cost a huge amount of money, and they sold, there were pilgrim souvenirs on sale all over the place. But people had little lead sort of press out things which they could fit together, very cheap. And then they would put a piece of a stone or a piece of cloth which they'd pressed to a shrine, because holiness was seen as contagious. So if something touched something holy, it became a secondary relic. So it meant that even people who had nothing, no means of buying anything, could get a really, really cheap relic to take home, and that was special for them.
It's absolutely fascinating. I'd be going for the piece of cloth rather than the ingesting of.
Yeah, me too, I think, yes.
So we've got any other questions if our audience would like to post them in the Q&A. We've got a few minutes left. But another question that's come in, Dee, is to sort of ask about your current projects, what those are and what you're looking forward to doing next.
Well, we're working with, we're continuing to work with a range of churches and cathedrals. And I think there's a real sense in which people are trying to rediscover what can be offered to people by way of pilgrimage sites and enjoying, because churches and cathedrals form a huge part of our built heritage, and they should be open and able to be enjoyed by everybody, no matter what background you come from. They're part of our shared heritage. So we work a lot with a range of places on that. Also, very interested in seeing how post-COVID, or as we emerge from COVID, how buildings which in the past have always been there for people in times of emergency, in times of crisis, can, as they reopen, become places of comfort and help to people. Because that's been something that people as a whole have really missed. We carried out very large surveys, and a lot of people who don't engage with churches normally have said, we have so missed that during COVID. We've been bereaved, or we've been anxious, or we've been ill, or we've just been cooped up, and we needed beautiful, safe spaces to go to. And for a while they were closed. So as they reopen, I think there will be a lot of interest in having places and opening them up in a way that's very accessible, not at all threatening, very hospitable, but says, here you are, here are some spaces you can feel at home, and just kind of following the footsteps of all those thousands, millions of people before you who found these places of sanctuary. And that was a word that was used to us during our research, again from people outside churches, saying we needed safe places, we needed places of sanctuary. And that's the function these buildings have exercised through the centuries. And it would be great if they could be opened up in a way that would make that happen again, as people are going to take a long time to work through the consequences of COVID and the impact on their lives.
Thank you, Dee. We've got a question from Carl, which is specifically about the experience of Christian pilgrimage, or the pilgrimage journey through a church, the design and the layout of a church or a cathedral, being a deliberate representation of the Christian pilgrimage journey through the Holy Land to Jerusalem, the idea of the Galilee porch, east window facing Jerusalem. And Carl's just saying, asking a question about, is that your sense of how churches were designed? Pews in the nave representing a ship heading towards Jerusalem, he's asked about, and what's a good guide to sort of making sense of churches and cathedrals in this way. Dee, can you recommend something?
Well, there are various books on understanding how churches work. I think these are quite specialist questions. Certainly the journey west-east through a church was usually designed from very early on, and we can see examples in Constantinople as well as Jerusalem, to actually take you through, open things up, get you to the center, and very often the shrine would have been towards the east. So it's a process that you go through. I haven't come across the idea that the pews are part of the nave in that sense, partly because a lot of churches would not have had fixed views. Certainly the big pilgrimage destinations wouldn't have had those. But I think that sense of movement, and so going in through the West End, and very often you had, as you approach, you would have seen statues of Christ and the saints, framing that entry point, and moving through and getting a sense of getting closer and closer to a point where God was really waiting to welcome you. I think that sense of journey, I think, is absolutely right. And then as you leaving was also important. That what you took away was that sense of encounter, not that you left it behind, but that God was, for the medieval pilgrim, God was back in their place of work, their home. And so what they were coming for was an intensified experience, which ideally they would then feed into that longer journey through life. So the two were mimicking or balancing each other.
Yeah, so there's the physical journey and the physical experience in these places of pilgrimage, but there's also an inner journey that's happening at the same time. And that again, I'd recommend your lecture for that sort of idea of the inner pilgrimage for armchair pilgrims, which, you know, it's absolutely fascinating to discover that people were reading tour guides to the Holy Land and doing that kind of armchair pilgrimage even in the Middle Ages, as well as, you know, reading tour guides and pilgrimage guides today. So I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our time together, Dee, but you know, of course, I want to end with a York question, which is, you know, we've talked about Becket and what a compelling experience you and the team have created in Canterbury. Could we end with a word for St William? And you know, what if you had a dream project to sort of, you know, bring that story of William? We've got wonderful colleagues at the university who've done some fantastic work on the St William window, Sarah Brown and colleagues from the Glaziers Trust in the past. But where is kind of William in York Minster today? And is there something you and the team would like to do for him in the future?
Well, William's tomb is down in the crypt, and it's a very lovely space, very peaceful little space. His shrine would have been, well, originally he was in the nave where people could have got to him. Then they built a very splendid shrine, little bits of which are still around in the Yorkshire Museum. It would be really interesting to recreate that. I think one of the fascinating things about William is that he's kind of a more homely saint than Becket, and his cures are more homely, sometimes unusual, like the woman who swallowed the frog. But he is, my colleague John Jenkins, who's done a lot of work, excellent work on him, describes him more as a sort of GP saint. So, you know, he was approachable, he was accessible, not necessarily the big dramatic stuff, but a very real presence for the people of the Middle Ages in York. And I think it would be very interesting to explore how the Minster could look at that and see itself as a place for pilgrims of all kinds to come today.
Thank you, Dee. Well, I you know, on behalf of the Festival of Ideas team, I'd just like to thank you for sharing your knowledge and that of the team with us this afternoon and in your lecture. And you know, you've touched on so many things: the deep history of pilgrimage, sites that people can read about, but also hopefully go and visit, and also the impact of recent pandemic experiences and the need for these places today, the appetite and the need for places and sites of pilgrimage. And I can think of no better way to end a 2020 Festival of Ideas event other than talking about a GP saint. I love that idea, and I think that I'm sure there will be lots of interest in that from our viewers. So thank you, Dee, and thank you to the Festival of Ideas team for making this afternoon happen. The recording of the event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which I'm sure our audience are very familiar with. You can access that through the Watch Again facility from the Festival of Ideas website after the 20th of June. And if you've signed up to this event, you'll be contacted via email to let you know about that. So we hope that everyone who's been with us this afternoon will continue to engage with the Festival of Ideas. Keep an eye on our website for full details of all the events. We're coming to the end of this year's festival, but of course there will be some exciting announcements about next year's festival too. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on today's event and continue the conversations we've started using the hashtag York Ideas. So it only remains for me to say thank you so much to everybody, and we'll look forward hopefully to seeing you at future events, and Dee, I look forward to further conversations with you in the future. Thank you so much, everyone.